This lecture covers ancillary plot structures, elements that we find in plots apart from those main pieces of the plot, the exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion that we've talked about already. So these are things like foreshadowing, flashbacks, flash forwards, subplots, backstory, and a phenomenon called in medias res. I'm going to use jury of her peers as an example when it's appropriate, because we've already read that text. So let's talk first about subplots. So subplots are very similar to main plots of stories. They can have all of those plot pieces that we've talked about already. Sometimes it'll be a more abbreviated version of those, but sometimes they can be pretty well articulated plots in and of themselves, but they happen parallel to or intertwined with the main plot. You can usually tell a subplot from a main plot because it will take up less narrative space. It might involve minor characters rather than major characters in the story. Generally, it takes less attention. In Jury of Her Peers, there's this thread of Mrs. Hale thinking about her relationship with Minnie Foster, that is Mrs. Wright, before she was married. Those thoughts that Mrs. Hale has form a very subtle subplot about her relationship with that woman, including her regrets that she didn't stay in touch more faithfully with her friend after she got married. Next, let's talk about in medias res and backstory. So in medias res, it's actually a Latin term, medias, M-E-D-I-A-S, res, R-E-S. And you can take a look in the definitions to see exactly how that's spelled again. It means in the middle, and it just means a plot starting after some main action has taken place. So you're sort of leaping into something that's already happened as a reader. And that is definitely the case in Jury of Her Peers, because we start that story after Wright has already been killed, and it begins with Mrs. Hale being picked up at home. And so as a reader, we might be wondering what's going on. Why has the sheriff come to take her and her husband to this other farm? And so that's where backstory comes in. Often when plots start in the middle like this, pick up in the middle of the action, you need to provide some backstory or some information about what happened before the beginning of the narrative to help the reader understand the rest of the plot. Jury of Her Peers, that's accomplished through conversation between the characters as they're riding to the farm, and then, of course, in a very systematic way, when Hale gives his account as a witness about what he saw before he went and called the sheriff. All of those things are backstory. Another way of looking backward before the beginning of a narrative is using a flashback. So flashback is when you actually shift to another scene that occurred earlier outside the time frame of the text. In a certain sense, Mrs. Hale remembering young Minnie Foster and that description of her that she gives, it's kind of a flashback. It's not quite, because really it would be like sort of a shifting of the plot. Think about if you're watching a film and suddenly there's a cut to, you know, a memory of an earlier time. That's a great example of a flashback. But that's the idea, is when you actually look back and sort of envision and see those elements or that piece of information, that event that happened before the beginning of a narrative. And then finally, let's talk about two ways of looking forward in the plot of a text: foreshadowing and flash forwards. So foreshadowing, and you may be familiar with this term already, it's when there are hints and clues about what is going to happen. Take a look around paragraph 100 or page 588 in Jury of Her Peers. You see just before the men and women split up, the men to go out and look at the barn and the women to, you know, sort of stay in the kitchen and gather up some of Mrs. Wright's things. The men comment, and keep your eye out, Mrs. Peters, for anything that might be of use. No telling, you women might come upon a clue to the motive, and that's the thing we need. Now, of course, they comment shortly after, but would the women know a clue if they did come upon it? And yet this is definitely an example of foreshadowing, because of course they do come across the biggest clue, the dead bird, and they're able to piece together what happened. Foreshadowing is that kind of hint. It doesn't outright say what's going to happen, but if you're a careful reader, you can catch those clues and get a sense of what to keep an eye out for later on in the text. And then probably you won't be surprised when certain things do happen because of that foreshadowing. A flash forward, on the other hand, is, you know, a gap in time and then jumping to a place later on and providing information about that. Sometimes flash forwards can be embedded within a narrative and then it returns to the timeline. And sometimes, and this was really conventional in, you know, sort of 18th and 19th century texts, you get that flash forward at the very end of a narrative where, you know, things have sort of wrapped up in the main plot, and then the text will talk about what happens with all those characters, kind of wrap everything up nicely, you know, so and so and so and so got married, and you know, that sort of thing. Now, Jury of Her Peers doesn't really have a flash forward. That would be, you know, just to give you an example, if at the very end of that story where it kind of imagines Mrs. Wright still being in jail, if there had been then a break and then this last scene that talked about what happened to her, whether she was convicted of this crime or whether she you know, was released, that would be a flash forward that would move forward in time and give us a sense of what happened. We don't have that particular feature in this text, but that would give you an example of what that would look like. So these kinds of elements are additional structural elements of a text that can make plots even more complex, and that as a reader you should definitely keep an eye out for, because they can really help you to understand the meaning.